Hello and welcome to Antarctica Insight Live. Tonight I have the great pleasure to host our webinar on hand-built heritage, where we will be exploring the hidden histories of Antarctica's post-war architecture. My name is Ruth Mullett. I am the Head of Buildings and Conservation for the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us for this very special event supported by the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. As some of you may be aware, the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust cares for 6 remarkable sites, most former research stations on the Antarctic Peninsula. Tonight we'll take a closer look at these sites, looking specifically at the buildings at their heart. We'll learn how these buildings were designed for their environment, how the constraints of shipping and assembly meant that these buildings were often prefabricated in the UK so that they could be assembled by amateurs in Antarctica. We'll also learn how these buildings were adapted by their inhabitants, who used any materials they could get their hands on to repair, reinforce, or extend them. We will explore how and why these buildings came to be designated as historic sites and what is so significant about them. We'll talk about the challenges of conserving these humble wooden structures at the bottom of the earth in extreme conditions. To go on this journey tonight, I'm joined by Janie Price, a specialist in the field of architectural conservation. I'm very sorry to say that our other guest speaker, Michael Morrison, has been unable to join us tonight due to technical difficulties. We will miss him, but he sends his best. But to introduce Janie, Janie Price is an architect and partner at Kennedy O'Callaghan Architects. Janie has led the Royal Institute of British Architects conservation course, and she's worked on some of the most important public heritage sites in the UK, including Bletchley Park. She also sits on the Conservation Review Panel for the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and she's prepared conservation management plans for several of our sites. As we go through, please do post your questions for Janie or myself in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer these at the end. So, Janie, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure. If your job, often working with us, involves exploring the history, importance, and condition of our sites in Antarctica, can you take us right back to the beginning and tell us a little bit about how these structures came to be built in the first place?
Well, going back a little bit before the sites that you're currently involved with, I think it's probably worth mentioning about the Scots Hut in 1911. And the reason that I want to mention that is because that was considered to be a prefab. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the prefabrication of the timber huts this evening. And so that was the Terra Nova expedition, and it was insulated with seaweed and was in 1911 and then was shut in 1917. But the sites that we're going to be talking about more this evening are generally post-war, starting with Base A, which is known as Port Lockroy, and is the site that most people going to Antarctica try and visit, and many people do actually get there and visit it. And indeed, that's the one with the post office that you may have heard of. So that was built in the pre-war, but it was rebuilt post-war. And it was really the start of many huts that were built across the Antarctic Peninsula. And the British UK Antarctic Heritage Trust is now responsible for 6 of these sites. Most of them were built during a very significant period of peace in the 1950s and were largely part of the International Geophysical Year, which was 1957 to 58. And so there was a lot of building across the nations in Antarctica in that period. And the reason for them was to do some sort of international open research. In other words, any research that was...
I think we're just experiencing a bit of a delay from Janie, but I hope she'll be back with us.
Sorry, am I back?
You're back, Janie. Carry on.
Okay, sorry. So during that period of peace, many of the countries that had signed up to the Antarctic Treaty, which followed the International Geophysical Year, was sharing information. And so a lot of the work that was done was not only mapping of the Antarctic Peninsula and the mainland, it was also ionospherics and geology, and there was some work done on the ozone, as we all know. I've probably missed a few. Ruth, what have I missed?
Survey work. Did we talk about survey work? A lot of our bases were dog sledding bases, so we get associated buildings for the dogs as well. So kennels, usually just for the bitches and their pups, because the other dogs were expected to wait on a line outside. But we do have some kennels and some pup pens as well.
So just talking a little bit about these sites. So most of the UK sites are timber framed buildings, and we'll talk a little bit about those in more detail later on. But they usually had a base hut, which was where the men, and they were only men, no women, slept over winter. And so they had to obviously build shelters that would allow them to endure the Antarctic winter. And so they would have a base hut where they slept, and they would also have a generator shed, which was usually known as a jenny shed. They would also have, in some cases, a boat store. In many cases, they would have a balloon shed where they did their ballooning. The pup pens, as Ruth mentioned, and sometimes they called them pup pens and bitch pens, and they were separated, and they were basically kennels. The generator sheds also sometimes were accompanied by a chippy shed, which was where the woodwork was done. They also had water tanks. They had various other structures, and they had some significant radio communication, which was done by very, very large aerials. And so you can imagine the erection of such things in very trying Antarctic conditions was often very difficult. But we have a lot of documentary information that has been kept in the British Antarctic Survey archive, which allows us to get a little insight into the actual detail of how these things were put together, because they had site diaries, and diaries written sometimes by the electricians, certainly by the people who were the base leaders, and sometimes by the person who actually built the hut, who wasn't always the base leader, but was usually one of the geologists or one of the surveyors who took the lead in the building erection. And so we have a lot of information because they often wrote daily diaries. So when we're doing our research, there's a lot of information, not only photographs, which are very invaluable, but also in terms of reading the diaries, reading the reports, and looking at drawings. And in some cases, we have the original drawings. And some of the work that we have to do to unpick what's going on is to try to work out whether they actually erected them in accordance with the drawings or where they made changes. And in some cases, the drawings were done for one base. So they're known as either a base or a station. So we have station A, which is Port Lockroy, and it goes right the way through the alphabet with some gaps. And so a lot of the buildings had a drawing which would be called, for example, base Y crossed out and then base E written on. I'm not sure that I've necessarily got those two in the right order, but the drawings were sometimes shared and adopted. And so they were really a kit of parts that were prefabricated in the UK and built by a company called Bolton and Paul, who I knew from my architectural education, because they were still producing windows and some industrial prefabricated buildings right the way through in the 80s. And so they were the provider of fantastic architectural drawings, which were very useful for us as students to have a look at how windows were put together and so on. But they prefabricated and pre-assembled the frames that the wooden structures were made out of. They then disassembled them, labeled all of the pieces of timber, and then packaged them all up ready to go on a ship out to Antarctica. So they had pre-assembled, sort of not entirely prefabricated buildings. So some of them were panelled, but most of them were just the timbers that were prefabricated, pre-assembled, labelled, and then sent with fairly detailed plans. And so they would have, for example, a foundation plan that would show where they were to build concrete foundations. And then they would have a frame assembly plan. And then they would have sections that show how the frames go together. quite detailed and quite good drawings. But of course, the people who were then going to be assembling these on site weren't builders and had never built anything in their lives. And so they were geologists or surveyors. And so usually very, very good practical people who did very well. But in some instances, they didn't quite get it right. So for example, we had an example of one window that had been put in upside down because the person assembling it just didn't really know what a window was meant to look like and what profiles were meant to be the right way up. So it's not.
So how do you think you'd rate our chances, Janie, if we were to try and put one of these buildings up in Antarctica today? Sort of a kit box. Would we do okay?
No, having gone through 9 years of architectural education, 7 of architecture and 2 of conservation, I don't think I'd be as good as they were. But they had quite a lot of problems. So part of the problem was, firstly, they had to make their concrete. And so they have to mix their concrete. And so in some cases, they use seawater to mix their concrete. And salt water and concrete is not necessarily a very good combination. But they either had to do that or they had to melt snow. So they've done a bit of each in the different sites. And then when it came to putting up the timber frame, generally they've done quite well. But there are some instances where they didn't put all the fixings in. And so we found that there's been a bit of slippage and a few problems where there are a few fixings missing. And then internally, they did quite a lot of weatherproofing by the designs had been slightly modified from the standard kit of parts that the Bolton and Paul huts would have been if they were built in the UK. So they adapted them. So in some cases, they've got triple structures. So they've got 3 layers of, for example, built up of the floor. So you'd have a diagonal layer of timber, and then you'd have a layer of rubroid, which is like a rubber felt, and then sometimes a layer of asbestos, and then another layer of floorboards or plywood, which would be in the opposite direction. And similarly with the walls, they often had a layer of, some of them had a layer of rubroid, which is intended to be an airtight layer, but they didn't quite manage to make it airtight because they didn't manage to seal it at the windows. And as a result, some of the huts were very drafty. And draft is obviously a problem when you're trying to stay warm in Antarctica, but it's when you actually get a gap that becomes very, very serious, because if you have a gap in the construction, then ice will blow in, and it only takes a small gap of ice blowing in for the whole floor to become covered in ice in very little time. So any holes in the structure are very problematic. And so there are quite a lot of holes in the gaps between the frame or the timber cladding and the window edges.
Thank you, Janie. We'll get onto all those lovely questions of what to do with asbestos in our buildings today and the sort of modern conservation challenges in a minute. I'm really pleased to say that Michael Morrison has been able to join us. So to introduce Michael Morrison, Michael is a conservation architect and partner at Purcell Architects, and he's worked on some of the most significant buildings in the UK and Antarctica, including Scott and Shackleton's huts in the Ross Sea, and of course the UK Antarctic Trust's historic sites on the Antarctic Peninsula. He is the UK representative for the ICOMOS International Polar Heritage Committee, and also sits on the National Trust's architectural panel and is a commissioner for English heritage. So Michael, we're so pleased that you're able to join us, and I'm afraid I'm going to put you straight into the hot seat with a question. Now you're here on Michael, you've worked on a variety of structures in Antarctica, from the sort of early 20th century Scott and Shackleton huts designed to support exploration, to the huts designed to support scientific endeavour from the mid to late 20th century that we've just been exploring a little bit with Janie. What do you see as the main differences and similarities of construction and of function in all of the Antarctic huts you have looked at?
Gosh, well, fingers crossed. Let's hope that this thing actually works, because we spent a jolly 3/4 of an hour before the broadcast started going on and off line, but it appears to be working at the moment. It's an interesting question, Ruth. I think I probably would have done better with the answer with 2 days to think about it. The sort of similarities are that they were put up as temporary structures. I don't think anybody really expected them to be there very long. Certainly, the sort of early ones that I looked at for Antarctic Heritage Trust New Zealand, so the two Scott huts, the Shackleton hut and the Borgravink one, was seen as something just for that expedition. And I think they would be astonished that we're still repairing them 100 years later. And to some extent, that applies equally to the huts put up in the 40s and 50s for the Falkland Island Dependencies Survey. And so I think that's probably the sort of main similarity. I mean, other than that, I guess the fact that one of the pleasures of going there is seeing the sort of minor modifications people have made to make them better to live in. It's the sort of it's impromptu coat hook that's been put up, or the bar that's being created out of some packing cases. It's those sort of minor modifications. And I mean, I'm a child. I mean, I was born in '48, so I'm a child of the 50s. And one of the real interests of going to the huts, particularly Damoy, which is probably my favorite hut of all the ones that I ever went to, was the fact that there was so much of the contents left, and it was so reminiscent of my grandmother's and mother's kitchens. It had everything about it. I mean, from the cooker to the sort of some of the foodstuffs that were left on the shelf, and so getting into that feel of how they lived. And you get the same sort of feeling with Scott's hut at Cape Evans, where there is again a lot of contents left, much less so with Borgravings. That was interesting what Janie was saying, prefabrication, because maybe the first and best example of a prefabricated hut was the one put up by Borgravink in 1898-99 at Cape Adair, which is that's actually the Stores hut, which stands next to the main hut they lived in, and you can see it's yes. Well, that's an interesting. Just keep that picture on there for a moment. I mean, you can see Borgravink's hut in the background, and it's a Norwegian hut. It slots together out of boards that are effectively 3 inches thick and 6 inches high, and they're tongued and grooved, and they slot together, and it produces an amazingly stiff and stout building. And I mean, this is a very, very exposed bit of the world. I mean, you get fantastic katabatic winds of 100 plus kilometers an hour. In the foreground is the hut put up 14 years later by Scott's 13 years later by Scott's Northerny, and there's some very nice descriptions of how they bent more nails than they actually managed to drive in. And this was a sort of typical balloon frame hut that was put up. And as you can see, Borgravink's hut is still standing there absolutely fine. And the Scott hut put up by amateurs is, well, the only little bit standing is on the left-hand side of that picture, which is actually the porch, but the rest of it is in a state of complete collapse. Sorry, I'm not sure that entirely answers your question, Ruth. But
no, it's all interesting stuff, Michael. We're really pleased to hear it. I wonder if we could just come back, because it was so tantalising, really. You were explaining a little bit about what the insides of these huts were like and what kind of belongings are left behind, and I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit on that. What sort of luxuries did people have with them, and what were the essential kit that are still there that you were able to see?
Oh, well, I mean, in many ways, the huts vary a lot, so that you have some that were cleaned up very effectively. So the one at Stonington, for example, which I think is the most horrid hut, and I hate it as a historic building. That one is when we went there, it had been used by some previous visitors, and they had left it in a disgusting state. They'd used one room as a sort of latrine, and it had shutters nailed on the windows that you couldn't prise off however hard you tried. And that hut had been cleared completely, apart from a few paperback books, which was a very odd sort of and one or two sort of things they couldn't move, like the essay cooker. Whereas some of the other huts, I mean, detail in particular, had everything from clothing, dog harnesses, tubes of ointment, foodstuffs, magazines, memos, invented games. Sort of, they'd made their own versions of various board games that clearly not much to do in those long dark nights.
Yeah, and I think there's a handmade Scrabble board at DTI, isn't there? And and at other sites we have a variation of a Monopoly board that uses Antarctic sites as the pieces.
But in some ways, I think what's outside is as interesting as what's inside. And one of the things which I think is slightly sad is that for much of the period before the Antarctic Heritage Trust got involved, these huts were seen really as a sort of an environmental blot on the pristine Antarctic horizon. And so there was a lot of sort of cleanup, and that's not just the huts down the peninsula. I mean, if you go to Scott's original hut at Hut Point, it sits in just a completely open space that has literally been cleared with a bulldozer, so that there is nothing outside it at all. If you take a hut which is, that Bass would have been looking after, so Horseshoe still has quite interesting contents inside, but outside it's really been cleared up. Well, you can see it there. It's been cleared up to a large degree. There's not a lot round it, whereas at DTI, nobody ever got in to do a cleanup, and the same at the Viewpoint. So you have a sort of terrific array of stuff, from rubbish heaps to gas cylinders to oil cylinders to old sledges to rubbish dumps, and they in many ways give a sort of character and an explanation to the place, which you lose if you clear it up completely. And at Stonington, the clearance round the British hut, I mean, the things like the pup pens and the masts and things are still there, which are interesting, but it's very desolate in terms of what would have been round it when it was occupied. Whereas if you go just sort of 250 yards away to the American base, which hasn't been cleaned up, you have an astonishing array of rubbish round there. I mean, absolutely splendid rubbish there's a small tank, for example. Why anybody would think that a tracked tank would be much use in Antarctica is interesting. But they range from the fascinating to the absolutely disgusting. There's a huge array of full latrine tins which have been taken round the corner and left to freeze, which probably have fantastic capacity for some scientists to analyze the contents to see what they were eating and what they were suffering from. But I think in a way the outside of the huts need to be thought about as carefully as the insides in terms of the contents.
Absolutely, I think that's a wonderful point. I think it leads us very well into thinking about the conservation of these sites today, because of course decisions about that debris that surrounds various huts are ones that we spend quite a lot of time thinking about, and trying to ensure that the work that we're doing in the sites that are in our care are managed in an environmentally responsible way. So just a bit of context perhaps for our listeners about the cleanup that Michael was talking about there, putting it into sort of giving you some historical dates. In 1991, the Protocol on Environmental Protection was signed by the Antarctic Treaty Party. So this formed part of the Antarctic Treaty, which had been signed earlier in 1959, designating Antarctica as a place for peace and science. And this piece of legislation, it laid out, amongst other things, what needed to happen to unused buildings and their contents in Antarctica. So in unglamorous terms, conservation in Antarctica is a form of waste management. There were three options for these sites. They were to either clean them up, as Michael has described there, dispose of them, bring them back into use, or they were to be designated and managed as historic sites. And of course, the sites that we look after today are those that have been selected as important enough to be designated. In 1996, I think a number of former research stations were designated, and between 2007 and 2014, the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust took on the custodianship of 6 of these sites. And this is where our hard work begins. To go to you first, Michael, in 2006, you undertook a heritage survey on behalf of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust and British Antarctic Survey. And you were sort of really in the midst of this, thinking about what happened to these sites and what we did with them. What were your what did you see as the main conservation challenges when you went out at that time?
Money, which is always the main conservation challenge for anything, anywhere. The question of the machine going here. I think there was an interesting challenge in that I was asked to go down because your patron, the Princess Royal, was going down and had got the use of HMS Endurance, the icebreaker. And so I sort of tagged along as part of the party, funded a third by yourselves, the Antarctic Heritage Trust, a third by the British Antarctic Survey, and a third by the Foreign Office, who, all 3 of them had rather different objectives, I think it'd be fair to say. The Foreign Office see the buildings there as a way of maintaining the sort of the claim under the Antarctic Treaty to territory on Antarctica. So they liked the buildings being there, but they certainly didn't want to spend any money on them. The British Antarctic Survey were responsible for the buildings, but they're funded by the Environmental Research Council, and so if it isn't a historic building or in use, their remit was to get rid of it. And then, of course, there were yourselves who were saying, well, these things are very interesting and should be preserved. And it's interesting to note that 2 of the buildings that you now look after and which are now designated as historic buildings, Damoy and Damoy, were not at the time, and they were both scheduled for clearance by the plans that existed then. One of the things that I felt strongly about and suggested, but I don't think anything came of it, was that there should be another category for buildings which were actually in a perfectly sound state that perhaps required a minor bit of repair, and they should be simply left to for time to take its course. And in many ways, I don't think anybody formally agreed that, but that's what's happened, because both Dita and Damoy are seen as thoroughly significant bits of heritage. So it has all changed over time, and no doubt will continue to as well.
Thank you, Michael. Janie, you're now involved in our conservation management, and you've helped to help us think about the sort of plan and the history and the schedule of works. How do we go about dealing with some of these conflicts that we've already touched on tonight? So, that part of our original construction materials may be dangerous or difficult, like asbestos, for example, and also the waste, if you like, or debris that we find outside some of these sites that have an important story to tell about the use of the sites. What do we do about that kind of conflict or challenge?
Yes, so I think the first thing with conflict and challenge is you need to understand everything about the building and the site before you try and do any intervention. So first of all, actually, all the reports that Michael wrote when he was doing his visits in the 90s have been the main source of information, as well as the original source information from BAS Archive. So his was the sort of the first go-to source of information, which has been fantastic. We've then backed that up with BAS Archive research, and obviously looking at the primary evidence from recent photographs that have been brought back, so that we can understand the current issues with the buildings and how decay over time has taken its toll in some cases, but many of the buildings are actually in fairly serviceable condition. But we have to think first and foremost about the health and safety. So we have to think about our own health and safety for the teams who are going down there, but we also have to think about the wildlife. And as you saw from the Adelaide penguins that were in Michael's photograph earlier, that there are some very serious considerations. So we have penguins. We also have sheathbills, which are considered to be a bit of a pest, but still need to be taken into account. And obviously we have the the very inquisitive sea lions that we have here. I'm assuming that is a sea lion. Is that right?
No, it's a fur seal.
Thank you. I was getting a bit of a blank there. So we have to make sure that we don't do any work that would actually cause problems, but also we have to make sure that we do work that prevents problems. So when we have broken glass, when we have bits of things that are flying around, and when we have hazardous waste, sharp implements, then we do have to intervene and we do have to do something about them. We also have a lot of health and safety issues from a lot of contaminants. So there are a few radioactive elements within some of the huts. Obviously, the big one is asbestos. And just taking that as an example, the three things that you can do with asbestos are remove it, encapsulate it, or make it safe in some way. And so we are doing assessments, because obviously, first of all, you have to understand what the extent of it and what it is and whether it's particularly hazardous or not. But generally, as it decays, even the ones that are relatively safe in situ, once they decay, they can become hazardous. So the first thing to do is to have a survey done so that you understand it. But actually, the teams of people who are going down have to get their own training, because we haven't yet sent down any work parties that will specifically be to deal with asbestos. So we have had to deal with it as and when. So every work party that goes down gets training in asbestos, partly in understanding which types of it are dangerous and which aren't. And there have been the British Antarctic Survey asbestos surveyor has been out, I think, twice and done an asbestos survey of some of the sites, but he only had half an hour at some of the sites or 2 hours at most at others. And so it's fairly cursory. And obviously there are other areas of decay, for example, the flues, which are in quite a serious state now because the asbestos linings of the flues are breaking up. And so some of the work that's been done in the last couple of years has been to try to encapsulate it as a temporary measure, and then get enough information so that we can work out what we're going to do. So just to take another example, so for example, at Bletchley Park, which is easier to get to, but has very similar buildings, they made a decision that they were going to remove all the asbestos that they could while we were doing significant works. In Antarctica, we're tending to do maintenance work and fairly low cost regular visits. And we are considering doing more of a sort of capital project, which would be a higher intervention, higher cost project. And that might be an opportunity to remove asbestos, but for the time being, we're trying to contain it and make it safe and deal with the immediate small problems that we have, rather than trying to take it all away, or because there are serious questions about, well, what do you do with it? Where does it go? What are the protocols for removal? Does it go back to the Falklands? Does it go to Argentina? Does it come back here? All of these questions need to be addressed on a policy level. And so you need to have time to work out the extent of the problem and then work out a strategy.
Thank you, Janie. I think we need to quickly touch on the future of conservation in Antarctica before we open up the floor to questions. But I think there were some lovely examples of some of the practicalities of working in this remote environment highlighted in your answer there that I hope we'll have time to come back to. But to think about the future, I think it's important for us to recognise that Antarctica is one of the fastest warming regions anywhere on the planet, and we're already seeing increased precipitation, both of rain and snow, at our sites. And this damper environment is meaning that we are seeing already more fungal growth that increases our risk of rot to our timber structures. And that snowfall means that we also have a greater risk of structural damage due to these humble buildings due to the weight. And we've unfortunately seen some of that at Lockroy this year. So this is a start. And of course, these challenges aren't unique to Antarctica, but they are a place where we see them. So this is a question both for you, Janie, and Michael. Michael, if you would like to go first, what do you think are the main challenges for us going forward for the conservation management of our site, and how are we going to mitigate these risks, particularly those associated with changes to the climate?
Well, I think it probably depends a bit how far in the future you're looking. If you're looking over the next few years, I think you're heading in the in the right direction by making the work you're doing more systematic, going back regularly. I entirely agree in the context of the huts that encapsulation seems more sensible than ripping things apart in terms of asbestos. But if you actually look 25 or 50 years ahead, I mean, can one see tourism to Antarctica continuing? It's perhaps the ships themselves aren't a problem, but it's the fact that everybody has to fly down to Ushuaia to get on the ship in the first place. I think that thought probably needs to be given to detailed recording and making things available as virtual visits rather than real visits. And I've been heavily involved in South Georgia, which is within the Antarctic confluence, and so is a sort of an Antarctic island there some way off. And we are the scale of the problem there is so big, the scale of the asbestos is so enormous that we are looking very much at managed decline and see the complete capture of the whaling stations there, but it would equally apply to the buildings down the peninsula. Capturing them in every way one can, in terms of point clouds, in terms of videos, in terms of photographs, because I think in the long term it's difficult to see the present arrangements continuing.
I think you're absolutely right, Michael, and I'm pleased to say that the work of that detailed recording is already underway at our sites, and we're working very hard on that detailed recording for exactly the reasons you express. And just to turn briefly to Janie, because Janie, you recently worked with our 3D model of Damoy, which is our conservation project for this year. So I wonder whether you could briefly touch on the future there and how you yourself are using this new technology in the conservation management to sort of safeguard it for the future.
So these are some images that have been taken through a laser survey, which has been turned into a point cloud, which is effectively a very, very detailed 3D survey, which can then be translated into architectural drawings. But it's not only useful for architectural drawings, it's also phenomenally useful for interpretation. And the Antarctic Heritage Trust has a project ongoing at the moment, which is to digitally capture their buildings so that they can use them for interpretation. And I, as an architect, am very keen on using the same data capture for different reasons. So you can see the last image that was just shown there is us turning the data into 3D images, which are to scale elevations. So we can take slices through the building from the point cloud model and provide scale drawings that we can then reproduce at any scale. And we can have flat on elevations, we can have internal slices, which allows us to then show exactly where the shelves are, so that the artifact survey can rely on the architectural drawings, will then label all the shelves, and that will all go into the recording that's done by the people who are assessing the collections. And so the whole thing is very back to back. So the initial point cloud survey and the laser surveys that are being done by British Antarctic Survey's MAGIC department, which is an imaging department, can be used for a variety of reasons. So we've asked them not only to capture the buildings and the interiors, we've also asked them to capture the landscape as well, so that they can have full modeling of landscape, setting the context. And into the future, even if the buildings were taken away by tsunami or flood or climate change, then we will have very, very detailed records of the drawings, of the buildings and their contents. And it's down to millimeter perfect. So we can work out, from a conservation point of view, we can work out exactly what moldings are missing from windows, so that we can potentially prefabricate and assess what length of timber we need to take for the conservation projects. So it's very versatile, and it's very, very useful, and it's ongoing on all the sites. So they're systematically going from site to site and doing this surveying at the moment, but we haven't yet implemented transferring them all into the architectural drawings. That's a project yet to happen.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Janie. And I think we've got lots more, I think, that we could talk about. So maybe the time is right to open up the floor to our audience tonight to see where you might like some elaboration on the very interesting points that Janie and Michael have been talking about. If you haven't already, please post your questions in the chat box. But do we have some questions all ready to go? Okay, so here's a question. How much of the prefab was panelized versus kit of parts slats like the ones in the photos? Janie, would you like to start with that one?
Yes, so we've seen a few photos of a few different sites, and so it does vary from site to site. The one that Michael hated, which is Stonington, which is base E, is slightly panelized. And so you saw that the facades there were made out of plywood. In fact, it's not all plywood. It's also some much thinner and more fragile versions of plywood as a sort of earlier iteration. So some of those buildings were made out of panelized parts. However, others, as you can see, probably the majority of the ones that we're looking at actually are timber boarded on the outside. And some of those have panelized insides, so that, yes, so for example, this is vertical timber weatherboarding. Sometimes you get vertical, sometimes you get horizontal weatherboarding. And internally, you will have panels which have a little batten to just slot between the panels. This is another example of one which is plywood made. And so that's just a very simple construction with a timber frame and plywood panels. So those plywood panels would have been prefabricated. And that one actually, which is Damoy, had aluminium windows, whereas the others have timber windows.
Yeah, and Damoy is a particularly interesting case because the prefabricated panels for Damoy are made out of something called structure ply, which was insulated ply panels with polystyrene inside. And this had originally been a material that was used for insulating apple packing crates. And Damoy, I think, was only the second building to be made of this material, and then became quite the staple for Antarctic buildings going forward. So quite an interesting one that our team are currently working on. Could we have another question up, please?
No, you can't beat seaweed, an insulation term. Got it right.
That
is a good point. Okay,
yes, I don't know if you heard it when you were before you came. I did mention that the Scots Hut used insulation of seaweed in 1911.
Mm.
So how do the building designs make provision for fire hazard? Do you want to talk, Michael, about the setting and the fact that they had the different components of different buildings which were set?
Yes, well, I think they were very. They did all have very sensibly another sort of little hut on the site that had the wherewithal to survive when your main hut burnt down, and there are several remnants of huts that have been burnt to the ground. There's one that Hope Bay has a completely burnt out hut, and I think there's one at Stonington as well. So fire was a real issue, and I don't think there was. There was certainly no real attempt to introduce any fire compartments into the buildings, but then they are very small. They certainly did have fire extinguishers. It was one of the things that I was concerned about when I did my look at the buildings, which is, gosh, it's 15 years ago now. There were fire extinguishers, but it's not much good having a fire extinguisher unless somebody is actually servicing it and keeping it in good condition. So if you're going to have them, you need to have a system of taking them away and bringing them back, or you need to leave the historic ones there as exhibits, but have some modern ones there that are actually going to work. But I think the huts were very vulnerable to being burnt down.
Because there were quite a lot of stoves which were used for heating, some of them did use asbestos for the flues, and so some of them have twin-walled flues when they're back to back to a room, and then single-walled flues in the areas where the room is itself. So that was some attempt at fire separation. Sometimes they had a metal plate at the junction between where one effectively compartment would go up through into the room above. But it's pretty cursory. If there were a fire, I think it would have just spread.
Yeah, asbestos, one of those things that was good at stopping fire, but unfortunately has contributed to our problems today. Fire risk still very much on our minds for all of our sites, and certainly impacts the rules and regulations for any visitor to these sites, and we won't have any naked flames anywhere near our buildings. Thank you both. Could we have another question up, please? Brilliant. Are there any records of the site's pre-clear up, maps, photos, etc.? Michael, I imagine you looked into this back in 2006. What might you say about this?
Well, you have to remember that my visit was pretty fleeting. I was on HMS Endurance and generally was flown off by helicopter first thing in the morning and dumped at the site and left there for the day. I think I got to stay at Stonington for a couple of days and Port Lockroy for 2 days. But most of them, it was a single day there. So, I didn't have a huge amount of time to do things. What I did certainly take a lot of photographs myself, and I think those will all have been deposited with the BAS archive. But I think that in terms of the clearance that had happened before me, I don't think anybody was bothering to record what was cleared. They were much too concerned about getting it done. And a lot of it, I think, would have probably just been shoved into the sea. One of the real challenges for AHT and for the New Zealand version thereof is the fact that you do rely on third parties to provide your transport, taking stuff in and taking stuff away, and the amount you can bring in or take out is very much governed by goodwill as much as anything else. So I don't think there are good records of the sites before they were cleared. I'm sure that's less, as time progresses, you get more information. So I mean, I would have quite good information about what was left around Detail, whereas Horseshoe it's got some stuff left outside, but it's all been sort of neatly piled up into we'll make this tidy before we go away stack, and anything that was rubbish tip has disappeared.
However, we do have a wonderful record in Bass Archive, so not necessarily immediately pre-cleanup. I mean, there are some quite good record photographs of the work taking place in 1994 in particular, that the British Antarctic Survey took when they were doing some of the clear up. But over the years, the British Antarctic Survey has an amazing array of photographs. So they are a bit haphazard in the sense that they're not yet all completely archived, but they're doing a fantastic push at archiving and labeling everything. And so there's a wonderful amount of source information. It's just a little bit haphazard.
That's right. And Janie, I think you've spent quite a lot of hours over the years going through some of those really rich resources that are stored in the British Antarctic Survey archives in Cambridge, which are available for public doing research projects of their own. And of course, we're still uncovering information, as Michael says, from families of those who work there, or even from the people who work there themselves. So it's not uncommon that we acquire new photographs or learn new information. That's wonderful. Could we have another question up, please? Thank you. So I'm a retired government archaeologist, so fascinated by totality of sites. Do you have archaeological input on preservation of sites and settings? Janie, would you like to have a go?
Yes, that's a work in progress. So we are getting archaeological surveys of the sites, but it's early days. So having an archaeologist to do assessments of the sites is definitely on the agenda, and archaeological research is actually now written into the policies. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Janie. And I think we've just got a couple more minutes, so maybe one or two more questions, please. There was originally an Argentinian refugio at Damoy. Is it still there? What might be its future? It is still there. It is not part of the historic site and monument of Damoy. It is kept there as an emergency refuge and operates as an emergency refuge still. So it is regularly restocked with supplies for that very important reason that I think Michael was touching on when we were discussing fire, that it's Antarctica, you never quite know when there might be need for a refuge. This refuge was actually constructed before Damoy. It predates the Damoy hut, but it is still there and it exists as a refuge for anybody in trouble in the area. Could we have one final question, please? How do you rate the long-term chances of survival for these buildings in the context of rising sea levels, increased storm intensity, frequency, and other such negative impacts of climate change? I think that's probably one that you'd both like to have a go at. Michael, can I pass it to you first?
Well, in terms of rising sea levels, I think that the hut of Wordie is a serious concern. I mean, the hut that's there at the moment was put back on the same spot as the previous hut, and the previous hut had been washed away by a large wave. It's about somewhere between 1 meter and 1.5 meters above the sort of mean sea level. So I wouldn't rate the long-term survival of Wordie being terrible. Do you think it's Gordon MacDonald from the conservation carpenter from Canada? I suspect it might be, and he probably knows more about it than any of the three of us on the screen.
Let us know, Gordon, in the chat, please, if it's you.
I think it is. It's a it's a major problem. But I mean, it's something that, as we touched on earlier, I think your long-term position probably is that the fate of the buildings is something that will over time, be increasingly difficult to maintain, and therefore the virtual capture of the buildings is so important.
Absolutely. And Janie?
Yeah, I completely agree. Long term, we have to keep an eye on strategy and policy, and decide at some point, are there emergency measures? Should we be moving them to somewhere of safety? Should we be letting them go? In which case you need to do it safely. And again, you need to think of health and safety and environmental protocol first. But in the short term, we can try to maintain the buildings and safeguard them, in the sense of most of them have hold down bolts, which are effectively steel cables that tie them down to the rock. And so we are replacing those or reinforcing those, and checking the fixings and checking the galvanized gauge on those and so on, so that they don't necessarily blow away in the next strong wind, which has happened to some of the huts in the past. So, but long term, yeah, we absolutely need to keep revising the strategy. So the idea of conservation management planning is that you're constantly reviewing, and it's can be a moving target, but you're always keeping an eye on the long term, the medium term, and the short term.
Thank you so much, Janie. And we are coming to the end of our hour now, so I'm sure every attendee would like to join me in saying a huge thank you to our speakers, Janie Price and Michael Morrison. It's made for an absolutely fascinating evening. Thank you both so much for your insights tonight. I think I can see from the comments that everybody has been really inspired and intrigued by everything you have to say. And thank you to our audience members, of course, as well, for joining us and for asking such interesting and thought-provoking questions. I hope that you have enjoyed it as much as I have. Last but not least, thank you to our production team tonight, to Jessica Norman, to Lawrence Becco, and to Heather Barrable, and of course to the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. And this webinar would not have been possible without you. So please let us know what you thought of tonight's event. Leave your comments or get in touch with us on email or social media. If you haven't already, please do consider supporting our work at the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. There are a variety of ways you can do this. You can become a member, you can adopt a penguin, or you can buy limited edition merchandise specifically to support our conservation season at Damoy this year. It all helps protect our Antarctic heritage, and you can find details in the link in the comments. So finally, our next Antarctica Insight Live talk will be announced very soon. But in the meantime, we're really excited to release a new series of our popular podcast, A Voyage to Antarctica, presented by Alok Jha and featuring special guests, including the historian Dan Snow and young birder and environmentalist Maya Rose Craig. Episode 1 will be released on Thursday, the 2nd of February. So watch this space. Do visit our website for more information, or search for A Voyage to Antarctica on your favourite podcast platform. So for now, thank you so much for making this such an enjoyable evening. And I look forward to seeing more of you at the next Antarctica Insight Live. Good night.